You're listening to the Full and Thriving Podcast, a place where courageous women come to break free from food obsession, heal their relationship with their body, and strive to live a life that's present, lighthearted, and meaningful. If you're listening, my wish is that this podcast serves as a catalyst that inspires you to nourish your body, nurture your mind, and energize your spirit. I'm your host, Meg McCabe, a certified life coach and eating disorder recovery coach with a PhD in having a good time. Just kidding about that last part. Anyway, thank you so much for listening and enjoy the show. Hello, lovely friends. Before we begin this episode of the show, I wanted to officially announce that the doors to the Recovery Collective are open today through February 1st. If you're interested in becoming a member and joining my private recovery community for online workshops, guest speakers, group coaching, and annual retreats, now is your time to join. This offer won't happen again until the summer. So please head on over to recoverycollective.mykajabi.com or use the link in the show notes to become a member today. Who knows, maybe your future best friend is waiting for you inside.
My favorite part about the Recovery Collective is that as of joining about a year ago, I finally realized how important it is to have a community in recovery.
It was definitely a turning point for me to finally talk to someone who's understanding.
The people in the Recovery Collective are some of the most lovely, supportive people I've ever met.
If you're thinking about joining the Recovery Collective, I have 2 words to say to you. Do it. Literally just give it a chance. I think you will be surprised in the most wonderful way.
Make the jump and join. It's honestly one of the best things I ever did, and I've made some of my best friends from around the world.
It's a safe place for me. I know I can say anything and never get judged for it. And I feel that we all truly care about each other.
Well, there you have it. Our members have spoken. And I might be a little biased, but I think our community is pretty great too. Hello, everyone. Today's guest is Ragen Chastain. Ragen is a speaker, writer, trained researcher, and thought leader in weight science, weight stigma, and the health at every size paradigm. Utilizing her background in research methods and statistics, Ragen has brought her signature mix of humor and hard facts to college, corporate, conference, and healthcare audiences from Amazon to Google. Ragen has been a guest speaker inside the Recovery Collective, and in this episode, we talk about her journey to body acceptance and how she became an activist within the fat acceptance and health at every size movements. We also talk about medical fat phobia and how harmful it is, and what is being done to help those in larger bodies get the care they need. I promise that you're going to love this episode and learn a lot from it. So sit back and enjoy the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Full and Thriving Podcast. I am beyond thrilled today to be connecting with a guest who I just love chatting with. Her name is Ragen Chastain. She is absolutely amazing. And she was actually part of our collective this past year and had a great impact on our community. So, Ragen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I am completely thrilled to be here.
Yay, me too. I was just telling Ragen, by the way, that I audibly said, yay, right before I got on the Zoom call, because I just love chatting with Ragen. She's always enlightening to me. Ragen, I always learn so much from you.
You do amazing work. I'm just always happy anytime I get to be a little part of it. So thank you.
Oh, thanks. The feeling is mutual. Today, I wanted to have everyone listening learn about Ragen's journey. And when I was doing research for this podcast episode, I went through Ragen's blog, and Ragen is a fabulous writer. And what she wrote was, my greatest accomplishment was to be learning to love myself and my body and to be truly happy living outside the cultural beauty norm. And I found that to be really moving and special, especially just the way you said it was something I think a lot of people in my audience struggle with. My intention of this call today was to learn how you got to that point of truly loving yourself. I wanted to ask you, Ragen, how did it start? Like, what was it like when you were a kid or maybe a teenager and you felt like you were outside of this beauty norm, this cultural beauty norm?
Yeah, so I was always kind of a bigger kid, but I was also a pretty successful athlete. And so I think I didn't get the kind of body shaming that I normally would have. Also, we moved around a ton and I went to a lot of tiny schools. My graduating class, I think, had 37 kids in it total.
Wow.
It was very different. When you live in rural Montana, like there's not, I think, as much pressure to be like cool or wear the latest fashions, or like when you have chores on a ranch before school, it's just not like Fendi, Gucci, not a thing. I was aware of the beauty norm, but not to the extent. And then when I went to college at the University of Texas, that's when I really became aware of like where I fit in on the beauty norm and how important it was to people to meet these standards of that, it turns out are completely rooted in like these oppressive systems of thinness, able-bodiedness, whiteness, etc. When I was a kid, I don't think I realized it quite as much.
Well, that's a blessing, I think, to be out of that hellhole that many of us are forced into at a very young age. That's great to hear that you didn't have to have those really impressionable years in that uncomfortable place. When you went to college, what was it like for you when you had the realization that people around you are way more superficial and judgmental about size and fat phobic?
My junior year of high school, at the end of my junior year, my friend's mom, who I'm certain was well-intentioned with this, said to me, you're going to lose that weight next year, right? Like, you don't want to go to college fat, do you? And it really impacted me. Previously, I hadn't really thought much about like dieting and losing weight. And afterwards, I thought about very little else. And so I went from dieting to that, the familiar spiral down to disordered eating and then to a full-blown eating disorder. That between like my senior year and my freshman year of college, I was not in a great mental space around it. I collapsed in a gym. I was briefly hospitalized, and I was lucky in that my recovery behaviorally was incredibly fast, incredibly atypical. But because I was bigger, I was always bigger, right? The doctors were telling me that I still had to lose weight to be healthy, even as I was being treated for an eating disorder. And I can remember a doctor saying, don't go crazy like you did before, but you're a naturally bigger person. So you're going to have to worry about this for your whole life.
Wow, that is devastating, but I'm not surprised.
Yeah, I know. Unfortunately, it's an all too common experience. And it's obviously what I wish I had heard him say was, you're a naturally bigger person. I could have saved myself years of strife had I actually keyed into that part of it and been like, oh, wait, there are naturally bigger people. And like, maybe we should just celebrate the diversity of body sizes and try, instead of trying to like somehow get us all to not be bigger, that kind of thing. But I did not at the time. And so it set me up for years of kind of the focus. I've never been like a big fashion person.
Yeah.
My focus for me in terms of fitting with the beauty norm was around thinness specifically. And so that's kind of where I centered my efforts and my focus and my goals.
I think many people listening could relate to that moment where you're recovering in a larger body and then people are still giving you those confusing messages about weight loss still.
I mean, you hear about it from people in treatment where everybody goes to get ice cream as a challenge food, but they're told to eat less ice cream than the other folks in their treatment program. Like the ways that weight stigma is inherent right now and perpetuated by eating disorders treatment community is a huge barrier to recovery for people in larger bodies, but to everybody. Because if you're saying to people with eating disorders, oh, it's acceptable to behave differently so you're not fat, that simply reinforces the behaviors that they're choosing to do, right? So it becomes a spiral where it's impacting everybody's ability to recover fully.
That must have been so frustrating to experience, just having to deal with weight stigma in the medical world during recovery.
At the time, I just didn't know any better. I mean, this is in like the mid 90s. The internet wasn't even as it is now, where you can like find a lot of community and easily and stuff. And so that seemed normal to me. right? I was like, yep, you're right. Like, even though I had sort of proven that at an extreme level, I could not get down to the weight that they thought I should be, I was still like, yep, got it. We'll continue to thrive. And I'm just incredibly lucky that I didn't have a full relapse through all the years of dieting that followed. A lot of my story is a lot of luck and privilege. And I always want to acknowledge that because it could have gone very differently.
Absolutely. At that point, had you fully accepted that you were living in a naturally larger body, or were you in denial?
I was not remotely accepting of that. No. And in fact, like, this is how I got into health at every size. For years, I was doing like whatever weight loss method doctors recommended to me. And I would have the experience that I later learned almost everybody does, right? I'd lose a little weight short term and then gain it back often more than I lost. And the doctor would either tell me that I couldn't have possibly been doing it right. And like, I had an eating disorder. I can measure my food. Like, this is a skill set, unfortunately, I developed. But I was in this program. It was like a medically supervised program. And I was actually being given less food to eat than I had been eating at the worst part of my eating disorder. But I was not allowed to do any kind of movement at all. And I should have been like, that's not right. But I wasn't, I just really felt like I obviously can't make decisions for me, but I was gaining weight on this program. And so I finally had enough and I went in to quit, and I told the lady at the counter, I quit, and I, stopped charging me. And she was like, oh, you can't quit. And I was like, no, I'm pretty sure I can. And so she's like, well, let me just talk. So she puts me in this little room with this huge poster about not quitting. It was literally that kitten on a rope that says, hang in there, baby. Well, I'm sitting here, this kitten on a rope. And this woman comes in. She's like a quote unquote counselor with the program, right? She got a binder full of pictures of fat women just kind of hanging out, being fat. And she starts flipping through it. And after a few flips, she says, maybe you don't know it, but this is what you look like. And these women are going to die alone in front of the TV eating bonbons. And is that what you want for your life? And aren't you tired of hating your body?
Wow.
I know, right? And I think about now, like, because I've told this story at this point so many times that like there's no emotional impact anymore. There's just the psychological awareness of how out of control and appropriate this was. But like, how many people got this speech and were like, you're right. For me, some cool things happened. First of all, I was like, wait, this is what I look like? Like, I thought I looked so much quote unquote worse than the people in those pictures. And so it wasn't like my ultimate goal of body, but I had that first inkling of like, well, if I don't hate their bodies, I have no problem with them. Why do I hate myself so much if this is what I look like? And then again, rural Montana, I didn't know what a bonbon was. That went right over my head. But I was like, I am tired of hating my body. Like, you're right. I'm exhausted. I had been for years hating my body like it was a job. Like I was getting paid for it.
Wow.
And I wasn't happier. I wasn't healthier. I wasn't thinner. I was just miserable and tired. And I was like, thank you so much. She said, oh, you're welcome. And you can pick up your bars at the counter. I was like, no, I quit. Like, it's you and the kitten hanging in there. I'm gone. But like, thank you. And so I went to my car, and what I decided, the sort of life-changing decision in that moment, was to create a 2-part plan. And part 1 was I was going to learn to love my body no matter what. I had no idea how to do it, but I just decided like this, because this whole becoming thin to like myself was not working out for me. And then I still thought like, oh, and then I'll have to like figure out how to lose weight to be healthy, but I'm going to do that as part 2 later. And so of course that became like a 2-part journey where I just like stopped this idea of trying to alter my body for a little bit to give myself space to learn to appreciate it.
Wow. Even though that lady was totally out of hand, I love that it showed you the gaps, or kind of like where her mindset wasn't matching up with yours, and also matching up, but it wasn't landing the way she wanted it to. Like, you were like, yeah, I'm so sick of hating my body. Thank you for bringing that up. And I actually love the way these women look. And I am kind of flattered that you're telling me I look like that.
Yeah. And it was interesting because I had been doing, like, I did activism my whole, like, I led my first protest in kindergarten, but I had been doing like a lot of queer and trans activism work in college. And like, I totally understood as a queer person, I could see the ways that oppression was working and had conditioned me to think about certain things. But when it came to fatness, I did not. Like, it took me so much longer to get that awareness. And like the fact, I think that she was so wildly inappropriate really helped me to be like, wait, like it was the thing that caused a little short circuit in my brain to be like, hold on, something is wrong here. And like, you need to explore that.
So was that when you first really recognized that? I'm sure you knew that there was always weight stigma and fat phobia, but was that when you really like saw it clearly in life since you had lived in rural Montana?
I think it was more that like, I was aware that fat people were mistreated, but I did not think about it as a form of systemic oppression. Even then, that took a much longer time.
Right.
So I was still thinking about it as like, I'm going to learn to love my body, like, even though it's a bad body or wrong body or whatever. Like, I wasn't fully letting go of that idea or like a quote unquote unhealthy body. Like, I was still in a very like helpless place about that. But I was like, before I do anything about my size, I have got to fix where I am with my own personal. So at the time, I really thought about it as a personal journey, and I wasn't thinking about it as like a systemic oppression.
That must have been very powerful to eventually get to that point. First of all, to be able to get to the point of self-love and body acceptance in that moment is a huge lifelong victory in itself. If you stopped there, that would be an amazing place to end up. But I love that you were able to transition and transform into a person who is able to see that this is a form of systematic oppression. And my whole life, I was kind of blind to it. So how did you start seeing it as that?
I went through this really personal journey, and like sitting in my car outside that weight loss clinic, I was trying to figure out somewhere to start, anywhere, right? I had literally no idea how to like my body. And so I hit upon the idea that like I had spent so much time hating it for essentially not looking like a Photoshop picture of someone else, that I hadn't had any gratitude for what it did for me. And so I went home and I wrote this huge list of everything I could think that my body did, and like granularly, like breathing, blinking, waste management, cell division, like whatever. And then like smiling, waving, like everything I could think of. Right. And then I became conscious of my thoughts about my body. And every time I had a negative one, I would replace it with gratitude from literally anything from the list. Right. So like, oh, I hate this body, but like, no, wait, like, thank you for breathing. You're killing it with breathing. I really appreciate it. Super important. Shouldn't be in charge of. I lost my keys 3 times. If I was in charge of breathing today, like we would be dead. So thanks. Great job. It sounds hokey, and it probably is, but it really fundamentally changed my relationship with my body to where I got to a point where I thought of like my body and myself as like a partnership. Because like I would not have allowed people to talk to my friends the way I talked about my body and let other people talk about my body. I realized like, here's this body that's doing all of these things for me all the time, even though I've treated it like crap, and it deserves my full-throated support. And so I know for a lot of people, they like to think of themselves as an integrated whole, and that is totally valid. For me, it helped me to think of it as like me and my body in this partnership, because I treated my friends better than I treated myself.
Yes.
That really fundamentally changed my relationship with my body itself. But the part where I get to activism is like down the road, where I, understanding, because I still just thought of it as like a me thing.
Yeah. That's the first work you have to do. That's like the primary work you have to do, right? Before you can really step into the activist role, is you have to believe it within yourself.
Right. And I wasn't aware of like fat activist community. There have been people doing this work since the 60s, since long before I was born, but for whatever reason, I hadn't been connected into those communities or been aware of them. And so it felt like very individual work, like queer community. I came out into a community where I was like aware of the history and aware of the work that people were doing, and I could research. But for this, I just didn't even think to look. Because it felt so personal. So I got to this really great place with my, sense of self and my relationship with my body. And I was like, all right, well, now it's time to like lose weight to be healthy. My background in school was research methods and statistics. And I realized I had never looked up any research on any of the diets that I did. I just did whatever they said to do. So I decided I was going to do a literature review, read every study I could on every intentional weight loss method. And I was going to find the method that worked the best, the most, the one that had the highest level of efficacy. And that's what I was going to do, because I was going to approach this scientifically instead of just randomly like I had been. I read all these studies, so many studies. And then I was so like in shock and denial about what I found that I went back and I read them all again. So I did my literature review twice, and I was like doing calculations by hand and like what did I miss? Because what I found was that there wasn't a single study, not one, where more than a tiny fraction of people were successful at long-term significant weight loss. Right. So the study conclusion would be everyone who complied succeeded at weight loss. But then when you dug into it, 68% of the people dropped out. And then the rest of them lost 5 pounds in 2 years, right? An amount of weight I could lose right now with a loofah and a haircut. And so the science, the research that was allowed to be done was like embarrassingly poor, like fail freshman level research methods poor. The way these studies were put together, the way conclusions were drawn. And I was just shocked because you expect better from peer review.
Right.
You know, and even now, like in my career, I talk to healthcare practitioners and like conferences full of doctors. And I'm like, look, you're considering these as primary sources. And that's the problem. You're being failed by the research. And then you're failing your patients because you've been failed. So anyway, so yeah, I was like, well, crap. Like as a fan of logic and math, I don't think I can do this anymore. Like what this says is that what has been happening to me, which is the short-term weight loss, long-term regain, is what happens to, 95 or more % of people. And that failure rate goes up for fatter people. So like, there's basically no chance that I'm going to become thin to be healthy. So like, what else is there? And that's when I started finding concepts around like weight neutral care and health at every size, but I still hadn't found the community. And I still thought of it as like a very personal journey. Like when I look back at that, I'm like, why wasn't I screaming this from the rooftops and telling everyone I ever met? But I was very contained in this, like, this is my personal journey. So I wasn't pushing back against the cultural narrative outside of myself. I was just like, oh, for me, I'm not going to do this anymore, which is very strange. Like when I look back, because everything else, if I think something's wrong, like I cannot help myself to speak out. It's like I was right, but I maybe shouldn't have said it right then to that person. You know what I mean? Like that's my usual MO. So yeah,
it doesn't sound like your personality to just keep it to yourself.
No, and I think I had been so thoroughly inundated, besides the concepts of like white supremacy, the idea that I could be thin if I wanted to and it would make me healthy had been sold to me more aggressively than anything else in my life by more people than anyone else in my life, again, except for white supremacy. And I think that I just wasn't breaking out of that. And so I was just conceptualizing it as like a me journey.
I think understandable considering how you're being attacked at every angle on weight loss tactics and dieting your entire life. These messages, it's scary to stand up against one person. It's another thing to stand up against an entire system.
Yeah. And at the time I was a business operations consultant. So it's not like I had a platform where I was talking about this. This was totally outside of my day-to-day.
Right.
And so I was involved with all these businesses that were my clients and like, that was what I was focused on. And so this just seemed like my own like little personal health journey or body journey or whatever. So I think that as I became an activist in transition and got a platform, I was able to push back a lot more, but I don't think I really felt like I had anything to say in that realm. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. So when did you start to spread the word and when did you come across the community? I'm assuming that was connected.
The community was like the last step. There are embarrassing things about that I will explain. So I started to do competitive ballroom dance.
Okay.
And I started out like dancing with a friend of mine at Sunday night lessons at a gay country western bar in Austin where I was living. And we found out we could compete and it was a rush to get costumes and to learn all the dances and to go to the first competition. And so I naively, honestly thought it was going to be about my dancing. And for the crowd performance, it was, I had been a cheerleader, dancer. I've been a performer all my life. And so as a newcomer, often people look like they are scared to death because they are scared to death. But for me, I was performing. And so I became like, I got a lot of crowd support for that reason. But then the judges would say things like, you're going to lose weight, right? Like what a waste of talent at your size, somebody said to me. And I was like, what the? And so I was a few competitions in and I was sick. And so I had done my dances. I had a terrible day. I should have scratched, right? But I have all of my dresses and makeup and everything that you take down. And I'm trying to get it back up to my hotel room. And I walk out of the ballroom and I watch for the elevator and I hear these like footsteps and I turn around and this judge is like charging at me. And so I like take 2 steps back and I'm like up against the wall by the elevator. And she's like, we need to talk about your waltz. And I was like, yeah, it wasn't a good day. I'm sorry. And she said, no, it was that dress. And I was like, what? Like, when you're sick and you're just not like super fast on the uptake. And I was like, what? And I had a new dress. It was beautiful. It was velvet with red embroidery and spaghetti straps. It was a gorgeous dress. I still have it and wear it to this day. She said, I couldn't stand to look at you. I had this moment where I was like, all right, do I go off on this person or do I like be quote unquote classy? And basically what I determined was that I was tired and sick. And so I just said, okay. And that was not the answer she wanted. And so she said again, I couldn't stand to look at you. And I said, okay. And she said it a couple more times. And then she put her finger in my face and she was like, you have no business wearing spaghetti straps. And like spittle is flying and like the veins are bulging out of her. I mean, that might not be true. That might be me like hyperbolizing, but like definitely like in my face, red face pointing at me. And in that moment, I was like, bing, this has nothing to do with me. Right. This is her body insecurity. And she's trying to give that to me. And like, I want a weave for Christmas. So I'm going to pass. And she said, I talked to your coach and he said I could talk to you about this. And I was like, well, I'm 30. So you don't have to ask permission to talk to me. I said, and in truth, I probably won't choose to change the dress, but I appreciate you taking the time to tell me it's such a problem for you. And her face got so red. I legitimately thought she was going to take a swing at me. Like I was thinking like, do I drop my stuff? Like, what do I do?
Yeah.
And so she turned around and stormed off. And that was the moment when I realized like, I just wanted to be a fat dancer, but I would have to be a fat activist to get it done. That this wasn't just about me. This was about other people because I told like being me, I told everyone that this had happened. And I was very lucky that people were incredibly supportive and like, do you want us to get her off your judging panels? And like, do you want us to say something? But it turned out other people started coming up to me, other fat dancers and saying, yeah, she did it to me too. And I was like, oh, this is like not okay. But everyone else was really ashamed. And so didn't tell anyone. And so again, luck and privilege and personality, I was just like, no, like everybody needs to know this happened. And so that was sort of the moment I became a fat activist. And I started my blog Dances with Fat, again, to write about like my personal experiences as a fat ballroom dancer. And then I started to write more conceptually about the ideas of body acceptance. I still didn't know there was a community. I said one time that the only two things you can tell from somebody's body size are what their size is and what your prejudices about that are. And somebody said to me, oh, actually, Marilyn Wan already said that. And I was like, who now? And that is how I learned about the community. So there are these incredibly embarrassing blog posts at the beginning of my blog where I think that I'm like making discoveries. Right. Which is like a ridiculous exercise in my ego. But yeah, so I then learned about Marilyn and Fatso and the community. And so I kind of like backed into the whole thing. And I was like, oh my God, like this is the Fat Studies Reader Shadows on a Tightrope. This has been going on since the 60s. And in fact, the Fat Underground started the same year as the Stonewall riots.
Wow.
And so as someone who's both queer and fat, to see the ways that those two movements have changed and what has happened for those communities is an interesting kind of thing to study as an activist. But yeah, that's how it happened. A judge told me she couldn't stand to look at me. And that was the final like straw that broke the fat girl's back.
Wow. And it was really out of necessity, like your activist role, you kind of had to speak up for yourself in that moment and spread the word. And then that's when it clicked for you. Like, this is something I need to keep talking about, specifically in the dance world. And then it expanded.
Yeah, exactly. I wrote a piece. I can't remember. I think it was like 386,126 unhelpful things. Basically, I just counted the number of negative body images I got about myself in 24 hours. Right. From billboards, magazines, the grocery store, completely unscientific. And then extrapolated that 24 hours to a year. It was over 370,000 negative things that I would hear about myself in a year if that 24 hours was represented. And so I wrote a piece about that and it got picked up by Jezebel.
Oh, wow.
I thought like 6 people were reading my blog, including my mom. So I have no idea who found that and like let them know about it, but they published it. And that was how my blog started to get notoriety. But I am the world's worst marketer. So I didn't even have a sign up, a subscription, nothing. So I got like 10,000 views in one day. I was like, this is the most I will ever get. I'm happy. And also none of these people have any way to follow me or know who I am. I didn't have contact information, nothing. And so a friend of mine, his internet marketer, was like head desking. And he's like, look, you got to get this together. And luckily Jezebel did a follow-up piece to the piece I had written. And so that's how my blog kind of started to get a following.
Okay. That's so cool to hear the background in that. That's so funny. Well, it just goes to show that when you have a voice and you care about what you're talking about, people are going to flock to you, whether you have the marketing skills or not. Like, if you have something people want to hear, or that is a relief for many people to hear. I'm sure many people heard that and were like, finally, someone speaking out against this. It's going to spread like rapid fire, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, and I mean, a lot of that is luck and privilege too.
Yeah.
Like as a white person, I have automatic authority more than a lot of people of color do. I'm currently able-bodied and neurotypical. I had a background in education that helped me. Like there's a lot there that, other people who have been doing the work and who currently do the work don't get the attention that I do because of those things.
Yes, that's a valid point for sure. For sure. So you have this Jezebel article and the follow-up, and then I'm still waiting to hear how you connected to this community, because I think you were really the first person who exposed me to this community. And I was mind blown when I first heard you speak. So how did you get connected in, and what was that like for you?
So the community was incredibly like open and generous to me and forgiving about those posts where I didn't understand that other people had been doing this work for, a really long time. And it was also part of the time, like the ways community are online right now is very different to where it was at that time. And so I started to get connected and like meet people in person. So got to have lunch with Lindo Bacon, and I got to meet Deb Burgard and hang out with her at an ASDA conference. And I was thinking about moving to San Francisco, to the Bay Area where Marilyn Wan lives. And she like took a whole day out of her life to like drive me around the Bay Area and show me places and hang out. And now she lives near me and we're friends. But the community was incredible in the ways that it embraced me, that my work got shared around. And I was still doing turnaround CEO work at that time. And so it was for me a little bit of an escape, because turnaround CEO work is incredibly stressful. Well, at least like I can go blog and like get my frustrations out about this. And the community became like a refuge for me in that way too.
Wow, that's really beautiful to hear, and I hope people listening to this look into many of the names you've mentioned today, just so they can kind of open their eyes a little bit to this really safe, accepting place. All right, so you've joined the community, and I wanted to read you another quote from your blog and ask you about it.
Okay, reading me to me.
Yes.
Awkward.
Awkward, but we love it.
Awesome.
You said, I am an unwavering advocate for size acceptance. The civil rights fact that fat people have the right to live in fat bodies. It doesn't matter why they're fat, what, quote, the consequences of being fat might be, and whether we want to or even can become thin. I wanted to ask you about this statement, because when I read it, I love it in the fact that it points out the assumption that everyone expects fat people to lose weight, and that they should be living in that mindset 24/7. And you're saying, no, actually, we have the right to live in a fat body if that's what we want, and if that's what we choose for ourselves. So can you explain kind of that mindset and how you broke free from that feeling of having to lose weight?
Yeah. So I had the research doing that literature review broke me of the desire to lose weight, right? I started to be like, if you want me to lose, to try to lose weight again, you're going to have to provide me some evidence that refutes my knowledge of this. And again, there's a lot of privilege in having the education to do that. It wasn't that somebody told me and I had to trust their knowledge. It was that I had read the studies. But I was still, even at the beginning, and you can see this in some of my earlier blog posts, I was still like wrapped up in like healthist ideas. Right. I used to talk about my own metabolic health numbers as like, as if that was, I don't know, representative. And I do think it's important to be clear that if supporting someone's health is something that they want to do, there are ways to do that outside of a weight loss paradigm. I think that's important to understand. But I think that can never detract from the fact that it doesn't matter, like if there are health impacts to being fat, or how, because we get this idea, oh, well, if you're fat, we can tell you're not prioritizing your health. Right. Well, you know what else shows that? The NFL, right? If you're a professional athlete in the NFL, I can tell you're not prioritizing your health, right? But we worship those folks because they're risking their short and long-term health in the hopes that they will someday win a piece of jewelry. So somehow that's different. But once I really started to see the hypocrisy in it and the ways that healthism was used to reinforce weight stigma, I always try to be really clear about that. So it's this idea that you have to lose weight to be healthy is erroneous. But the idea that you have to be healthy to deserve respectful treatment and a life without oppression is also erroneous.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So true. So true. And there's so many people in sin bodies who might not necessarily be healthy, but everyone looks at them and thinks, oh, they must work out all the time. They must be really healthy. You have to look at the world through multiple lenses. A person's health isn't our business.
No, that's exactly right. So this is like multi-leveled. So first of all, health is a really gooey, amorphous concept. Especially in our culture, we like to act like you could throw a dart and hit health, or like you get the health trophy. But what is healthy when you start to break it down? Like, because they'll say, oh, it's the absence of disease. Oh, so if someone is born with a chronic condition, then their health is just out the window for them. Oh, well, no. Okay, well, what about circumstances? And so there's a lot. Health is really like gooey and not necessarily a super helpful global concept in the way that we use it. So there's that. It's not an obligation. Like I said, the NFL, there's an Olympic sport called skeleton where you go 80 miles an hour down an ice chute face first. This does not prioritize the health, right? But I like to watch it. People like to do it, and that's all fine. But like, let's be honest, health is not an obligation. It's not a barometer of worthiness, right? That's just healthism. And it's not entirely within our control. We've got social determinants of health. We've got the ways that oppression impacts health. Racism is a public health crisis in our culture that often gets treated like something that people of color are responsible for, like dealing with on their own. The whole concept of health is really messy. I cannot recommend enough Deshaun Harrison's book, Belly of the Beast.
Okay.
To really kind of talk about this stuff. And Sabrina Street's Fearing the Black Body, the racial origins of fat phobia. Again, incredible work, but the way that this is rooted in racism and the way that it still does more harm, disproportionate harm to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color is something that we really need to understand.
Absolutely. I just wanted to make sure everyone listening is aware a little bit more about the medical fat phobia that exists. So could you briefly explain kind of the background for those who aren't aware?
Sure. So medicine, kind of starting in the 30s and then evolving over time, has become very focused on weight as a middleman to health. And so you see it with like the idea of body mass index, which is just a fancy ratio of weight and height, and the concepts of quote unquote obesity and quote unquote overweight, which were literally made up to pathologize fat bodies. Like we think of them as really sciencey, but the term obese is from the Latin root that just means to eat until fat, which is both not the experience of every fat person and not like a sciencey medical term. And so when you add like numbers like body mass index, it makes it sound legitimate and scientific. Body mass index is just your weight in pounds times 703 divided by your height in inches squared. It's literally just a ratio of weight and height. And again, these things are deeply rooted in racism. That has become the way that medicine is practiced. And this causes a lot of problems at every level. So research often doesn't include fat people. So like the Plan B morning after pill doesn't work for people who weigh more than 176 pounds. And that was not well publicized. People are taking this really vital and critical medication without any understanding that it wasn't developed for them. The COVID vaccine trials were considered groundbreaking because they included fat people at the same percentages that we exist in the world. Normally that doesn't happen. So there's research bias. Tools and best practices aren't developed for fat people. And then we get blamed if they don't work for us. Training is deeply rooted in weight stigma in ways that when you pathologize a body and then you have someone whose training is that their job is to eliminate pathology, you end up with a really eugenicsy relationship between doctors and fat patients, right? Where they see this as a walking pathology to eliminate before they do anything else. So every fat person I know has a story where they went to the doctor for like a broken toe, strep throat, and were told to lose weight, right? And the doctor just could not get their focus off weight loss. And so that's another way that it impacts patients, is that then people are given evidence-based treatments right away, whereas fat people are told, to diet, which can delay care indeterminately if they're not given the same treatment as the thin person the same day they walk in. So that's another big piece of the issue with weight stigma and healthcare. And so it's every level. And then what our system does right now is perpetuate weight cycling, which is that yo-yo dieting, right? Which most people will do. And weight cycling has been associated with cardiovascular issues, with increased inflammation. And Bacon and Aframore in their paper found that it could explain the entire mortality that was credited to being fat in both the Framingham and the NHAIDS.
Wow.
we've got a healthcare system, in theory, healthcare that perpetuates weight stigma and weight cycling and inequalities in healthcare, and then blames fat bodies for the harm that results, and then uses that harm to justify more weight stigma, weight cycling, and healthcare inequalities. And so it's this vicious cycle that fat people get caught up in, where we're being prescribed something that fails 95% of the time. And even if a doctor does understand, even if they're trying to come from a health at every size, weight neutral perspective, they don't have access to the tools that they need and the best practices they need to take the best care of fat patients. Because we have this idea that if fatness is the quote unquote cause for inequality, then inequality is justified, right? So if the MRI isn't big enough for your patient, oh, well, I guess they don't get an MRI. It's not like this is an outrage and we need to fix this. And patients of all sizes need adequate tools. That's not how we view it. And so that, again, perpetuates that inequality of healthcare that then perpetuates harm that then gets blamed on fat bodies.
Wow. Well, that sounds like a big disaster.
Total big disaster. A deadly disaster for many fat people.
Yeah, a deadly disaster. And I am so grateful and so thankful that there are people out there making a difference in the medical world like yourself and printing out these Hayes health sheets and spreading the word. I've worked at 2 hospitals before I had my own practice, and I saw fat phobia everywhere. It's like latent in the medical field. It's really disappointing to me because we trust doctors blindly. We blindly trust medical professionals.
Yeah. Deb Burgard was the first person who, I read it so clearly. She said, we diagnose in thin people or what we prescribe to fat people. Right. So the behaviors that we prescribe to fat people as quote unquote diets are considered red flags for eating disorders in thinner people. And that should be an obvious problem. But what scares me is how much the healthcare complex in general is willing to double down on this. So the first study that showed a 95% failure rate of dieting was in 1959. And it's been replicated through the years. It's been admitted by the United States government, the Australian government, and last year by a panel of obesity, quote unquote, obesity experts. So this is not new information. So finally they're saying okay, that doesn't work. So what we need to do then is extreme solutions that are even more harmful to fat people, right? So we'll do surgeries that risk fat people's lives and quality of life and take a healthy organ and put it into a disease state to force behaviors that mimic an eating disorder. And we'll call that healthcare. Or we'll say now drug manufacturers are trying. I just gave an interview to the official magazine of the American Chemical Society, which is, assuring that I will never again lose a game of 2 truths and a lie. But they were talking about diet drugs, and these drug manufacturers are pushing this narrative that just simply being fat is a chronic lifelong health condition that warrants lifelong treatment, which is convenient if you're selling drugs that don't make people healthier or thinner to say, well, if you're still fat, you need more drugs like that, I can see where that from a marketing perspective, but it scares me that this obsession with making fat people thin has reached such a level in healthcare that people are not separating it. I just saw the Mayo Clinic has a program where there's a BMI limit for organ transplant. So if you're above a certain BMI, you can't get a transplant, but they have this new program where first they'll put you on an extreme restriction diet. And if you don't meet the BMI requirement with that, then they'll still give you the transplant, but only if you agree to have quote unquote weight loss surgery at the same time. Which I'm trying to blog about it, but all I can do is F-bomb. So I'm having to back up from it and try to gain some perspective so I can write about it in a way that isn't just me screaming.
Yeah, that sounds so dangerous.
What I've got, right? The idea that undernourishing a body prior, and there's good research that shows that having extreme weight loss before surgery does not improve outcomes, that weight loss surgeries does not improve outcomes. And yet we're still doing this. You're telling me I'm too fat for one surgery, so you'll give me 2 after an extreme period of undernourishment. And this is what one of the foremost clinics in the world thinks is a good idea.
Yeah, sounds like a train wreck. Being undernourished and then having another surgery in that state. And I wanted to dive into another thing related to your activist work and medical fat phobia. And this is the new project that you just completed called the Hayes Health Sheets. And would you please share with those listening what that project actually is and why it's so important?
Yes, I'm so excited about this. So HAES, HAES, standing for Health at Every Size, HAES Health Sheets. So basically, the idea was I get tons of emails from people who are going to the doctor or went to the doctor and they were told by their healthcare practitioner, like, weight loss is the only solution for this, or weight loss is the correct solution for this. And so I wanted there to be like something they could print out, diagnosis specific, that would give them information. And so I reached out to Dr. Louise Metz, who is a Health at Every Size based internal medicine physician, and Tiana Dodson, who is a health coach and also a web developer. And so we together created these sheets. So they're diagnosis specific, weight neutral healthcare guides. And so they're meant for use by practitioners, but also patients and advocates. And then the site also has a big resource bank that has different like advocacy cards you can print out, as well as links to research. If people want to get into that. And then there's a page called Why We Don't Recommend Weight Loss, which is something like you could point somebody to understand why weight loss does not meet the criteria of evidence-based ethical health and healthcare intervention. So it's a project we launched in March. We've got like over 80,000 hits at this point, and we're just super thrilled that it's out there in the world.
That is such a cool project and so important. Have you heard of anyone bringing these into your doctors? Like, what are some success stories from this?
Yeah. So I hear from a lot, daily now, people who either they took it to their healthcare practitioner and it helped them have a discussion about the alternatives for care, from healthcare practitioners themselves who have used it and changed the way that they're practicing. One of my favorite success stories, this was pre the health sheets, but I got an email from a doctor who said, I started hate reading your blog 6 months ago. And at this point, I'm transitioning my practice to be fully Health at Every Size. And I just want to thank you for your work and let you know that it had an impact. And like, that's not like an everyday thing, but it's like, it keeps me going. Like, this had an impact on somebody. And, once you start being confronted with the evidence and opening up your mind to the idea that we might have been getting this very wrong for a very long time, change is possible. So yeah, I hear from people who work as patient advocates who use the sheets in their advocacy. So yeah, it's one of those things, a lot of my work, like I feel like I have a dream job that I wish wasn't necessary. With the world as it is, the work that I get to do full time is exactly what I want to be doing. And I wish that work didn't need to be done and I could go like be a stand-up comic or something and just like abandon, not abandon, but like not need to do it because the work wouldn't. So it's like a weird situation. So I'm thrilled that they're out there. I'm thrilled that people are, able to use them to get the care that they deserve. But I wish that none of it was necessary.
I'm in the same boat as you because I wish nobody had eating disorders, and I have a dream job that I wish would fire me, I wish no one needed me anymore.
Yeah, just trying to work ourselves out of a job.
Exactly. Wow. So that's such an amazing project. And I'm sure we could talk about this all day, but we have run out of time. Ragen, you are a true light. And it's just an honor to bring your voice to my audience because I know there are a lot of people who need to hear this. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me. It really is so important, the work that you're doing. And it's an honor to get to be here and be with you. So thank you very, very much.
Oh, well, you're so welcome. And everyone listening, I am going to drop all the important links in the show notes so you can get in contact with Ragen and check out her work. And yes, I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you so much for listening. All right, that concludes this week's episode of the Full and Thriving podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this episode of the show. When you have a moment, please head on over to Instagram and follow my recovery coaching account at Meg_McCabe to stay up to date on everything I'm doing in recovery land. And if you're feeling extra inspired, please send me a direct message to let me know how this podcast has impacted your life. I'd love to hear your feedback. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week.